Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. They say that in the deepest corners of America, you can still find places the map forgot. Valleys where the wind carries secrets, and the mountains stand like silent witnesses to things no one dares to speak about. This story comes from one such valley. If you'd stumbled upon it by accident, you'd think it was abandoned. No sound but the rustle of dry grass, no footprints but your own. But deep in the hollow, in a rotting wooden house that leans like it's tired of standing, there is, or was, a family. A family tied together not by choice, but by the absence of everyone else. Our story begins not with a birth, but with a pregnancy. In the late winter of 1964, a woman named Eliza Mae was found to be expecting a child. In most towns that would be unremarkable, but this valley was not most towns. Here, Eliza's news sparked whispers that ran like wildfire through the few families that remained. The trouble was, there was only one man in the valley old enough and close enough to be the father, and he was Eliza's own blood. You see, the valley had been emptying for decades. The mines closed, the soil thinned, and the road out washed away more than once. By the time Eliza was 19, the world beyond the ridges might as well have been another planet. The population had dwindled to fewer than a dozen souls, all bound by generations of intermarriage. Outsiders didn't visit, and no one left. The children were born pale, with eyes that never quite looked the same direction. The family tree was no tree at all. It was a circle, winding back on itself until no one could say where the first branch had been. And now, with Eliza Mae carrying the child of the only man left, the circle had tightened. Those who knew her say she didn't speak of it, didn't cry, didn't even flinch when the midwife came to examine her. But her silence said more than words ever could, because in the valley, silence was the only language that could keep you safe. By the time spring crept into the valley, the whispers about Eliza Mae had turned into something darker, a quiet, collective knowing. The truth was like a bruise under the skin of the town, visible if you looked too long, but ignored if you wanted to sleep at night. People had their suspicions about the father, though no one dared to name him aloud. Naming things made them real, and in a place where the air itself felt heavy with history, no one wanted that reality. Eliza lived in a small, leaning house with her mother Ruth and her uncle, a man named Silas, though everyone in the valley simply called him Pa. He wasn't her father, not exactly, but he had raised her since she was a child. And in a valley where surnames meant less than bloodlines, there was no escaping the fact that Silas was as much kin to her as the woman who'd given birth to her. Those who had seen Silas up close described him as a man aged beyond his years. His shoulders stooped, his skin a pale, uneven parchment pulled thin over sharp bones. His eyes were small, set deep in his skull, and one corner of his mouth hung lower than the other, as if gravity had claimed it long ago. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words came slow, like they'd been carried up from deep underground. Outsiders might have seen him as a relic, a man trapped in the past, but here in the valley, he was the last man standing, the only man left. When Eliza's belly began to swell, she carried it without shame or pride, only inevitability. Some nights, from the dirt road outside their house, neighbors claimed they could hear voices through the thin walls, low, murmuring voices that stopped the moment anyone got too close. But the valley had an unspoken rule: you don't ask questions unless you're ready to live with the answers. As the months passed, the air in the valley seemed to thicken. The few remaining families began avoiding Eliza's home, walking the long way around when they needed to fetch water or trade for flour. The baby inside her became more than a child. It became a symbol, a reminder that the valley had no future beyond the endless repetition of its past, and that repetition was about to be born again. By the summer of 1964, the valley had grown unbearably still. The insects hummed in the long grass, the creek whispered over stones, and the old church bell, rusted and mute, watched over a community that no longer prayed. But behind the warped boards of Eliza Mae's house, life swelled in a way that was both inevitable and wrong. Her mother, Ruth, had taken to keeping the curtains drawn at all hours. She told anyone who asked that the sun was bad for Eliza's skin, but everyone knew it was to keep eyes off her daughter's growing form. Ruth moved like a ghost through the rooms, quiet, efficient, carrying food and water, but never lingering. There were rumors she'd once tried to send Eliza away, but no one knew where away even was anymore. The last bus had stopped coming years ago, and the mountain road beyond the pass had been washed out for an entire season. The valley was a pocket in time, and everyone in it was trapped. Silas spent his days in the shed out back, where the air was thick with the smell of oil and rust. He claimed to be fixing tools or mending the roof beams for winter, but his shadow loomed often at the back door, his small eyes flicking toward Eliza without a word. The neighbors avoided his gaze. In a place like this, the less you knew, the longer you slept at night. Some say the midwife, an older woman named Cora Holt, tried to intervene. Cora had been delivering babies in the valley for more than 4 decades, and she'd seen the slow deterioration of the bloodlines firsthand. Babies born too small, with limbs that didn't bend right, or eyes clouded over before they ever saw the sun. When she came to check on Eliza, she spoke in hushed tones, urging Ruth to think of the girl's health, to think of the child's. But Ruth just closed the door behind her, leaving Cora to walk the long road home under the weight of what she already knew. By August, the signs of strain were plain. Eliza's skin had taken on a pallor that seemed to drink in the shadows. Her frame, though thin, carried the heavy curve of her belly like it was pulling her toward the ground. And yet, she never once spoke of the father, never once let his name pass her lips. But then again, in the valley, the father's name was already written in the faces of everyone who lived there. The day of the birth came earlier than expected, as if the child was impatient to take its place in the long, unbroken chain of the valley's blood. It was late September, the air sharp with the first bite of autumn. Clouds pressed low against the mountains, trapping the world in a muted grey. Inside the dim, cramped bedroom, Cora Holt worked in near silence, her hands steady, but her jaw tight. She had delivered dozens of children, but there was a heaviness in the air that day, something that made even her steady fingers tremble. Eliza lay on the narrow bed, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Ruth sat in the corner, her face carved from stone, offering no comfort but never looking away. Silas paced in the next room, his boots thumping softly against the uneven floorboards, the sound like a slow heartbeat echoing through the house. Hours passed. The midwife's whispers to Eliza were drowned out by the muffled wind outside, until a single cry, sharp and brief, cut through the silence. The child had arrived, but as Cora lifted the newborn into the light, the room seemed to hold its breath. The baby was small, too small. Its skin had the translucent pallor of wax paper, and its head seemed just slightly out of proportion to its body. One of its hands curled tightly into a fist, the other hung loose at an odd angle. But it was the eyes that made Cora freeze. One drifted just slightly away from the other, giving the child a distant, unfocused gaze. Cora didn't speak. She simply wrapped the infant and handed it to Eliza, who took it without a word. She looked down at her child with a strange, unreadable expression, something caught between sorrow and inevitability. Silas stepped into the doorway then, his shadow stretching across the bed. For a moment no one moved. Then he walked forward, placed a hand on the blanket, and stood over them both like a figure claiming his legacy. No one outside that room ever learned exactly what was said, or if anything was said at all. But after that day, Eliza was rarely seen beyond her porch, and the baby, though it lived, did not cry much, only small, broken sounds in the night, like echoes from somewhere deep in the earth. As autumn deepened, the valley seemed to close in on itself. Leaves fell in slow spirals, carpeting the dirt road in shades of rust and brown, muffling the footsteps of the few who still walked it. Eliza's home, already a place people avoided, became a shadow on the edge of the community. Curtains stayed drawn, and smoke from the chimney rose only in thin, reluctant trails. The baby, named Jonah, grew slowly. Too slowly. His limbs remained thin, his neck weak, his gaze unfocused. Neighbors who caught fleeting glimpses whispered that his features were already marked by the valley's curse. The shallow chin, the wide-set eyes, the faint asymmetry in his face that mirrored too many others. But here, every face was a reflection of another, and no one dared to trace those similarities back to their origin. Silas was seen more often now, carrying Jonah on his hip when he stepped out to the yard, his gnarled hand supporting the child's head in a way that seemed both protective and possessive. Sometimes he would just stand there, staring out at the mountains, as though daring anyone to look too long. Those who did said his eyes seemed to hold something unspoken, not guilt, not pride, but a kind of grim acceptance. One evening, Cora Holt returned under the pretense of bringing broth. She found Eliza pale and thin, her hair dull, her eyes ringed with shadows. The girl was only 20, but she looked twice her age. Jonah lay in a cradle by the stove, his breathing shallow, his skin almost translucent in the firelight. Cora sat for a long while without speaking, then finally asked the question she had avoided for months. "Why did you stay, Eliza?" The young woman didn't look up from her lap. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper, "Because there's nowhere else to go." In that moment, Cora understood what the rest of the valley had chosen to forget, that Cape was not just a matter of roads or buses. The valley had a way of holding on to its own, binding them tighter with each generation, until leaving became unthinkable. The blood here was not just family. It was the only thing they had. And for Jonah, it was already too late. Winter arrived early that year, draping the valley in a silence so deep it seemed to swallow sound. Snow gathered in the bends of the road and on the sagging roofs, muting the world into a pale, unbroken stillness. The cold pressed against the houses, creeping through thin walls and settling in the bones of those inside. For Eliza Mae, the days bled into one another, feeding Jonah, stoking the stove, listening to the wind scrape across the eaves like a restless spirit. The child did not grow as he should have. At 6 months, his weight was scarcely more than at birth. His eyes wandered in opposite directions, his grip weak, his movements slow. Sometimes, when she held him, he would simply gaze into the middle distance, as though watching something no one else could see. And yet, when Silas entered the room, those pale eyes would shift toward him with uncanny focus, following him until he left again. Rumors began to drift through the valley like wood smoke. Some said Jonah would not see his first birthday. Others claimed he was a sign that the bloodline had run its course, that the valley was finished. Still, no one spoke these thoughts aloud within earshot of the old house. Silas had a way of appearing without warning, his quiet presence enough to turn tongues to stone. One night, during a blizzard that blotted out the moon, a knock sounded at Cora Holt's door. It was Eliza, her face raw from the wind, Jonah bundled tightly in her arms. She asked for medicine, her voice trembling, not from the cold, but from something deeper. Inside, Cora examined the child by lantern light. His breathing was shallow, his skin clammy, but it wasn't sickness in the way she knew it. It was something older, something that had been etched into him before he'd ever taken his first breath. Cora wanted to tell her to leave, to take the child and walk until the valley was nothing but a memory. But she knew Eliza wouldn't. The valley was more than geography. It was a chain, and every link was forged in blood. As Eliza stepped back into the snow, Jonah stirred faintly, his lips parting as though to speak. No sound came. Only the low moan of the wind answered back, carrying the same truth the mountains had always known. No one leaves the valley. Not really. By the time spring returned, the snow melted into grey rivulets that carved the hillsides, revealing the bones of the valley once more. Grass pushed through the thawed earth, but it grew thin and weak, much like the people who remained. Jonah had survived the winter, though just barely. His body was frail, his head still too large for his neck, his voice nothing more than a breathy whimper. Yet there was something in his gaze now, a quiet, almost knowing stillness that made even Cora uneasy. The townsfolk spoke less of Eliza and her child as the months passed. Not because the scandal had faded, but because speaking of them felt like invoking something best left undisturbed. Still, eyes lingered when Silas carried Jonah to the well or stood on the porch in the dying light of evening. The boy's features were sharpening now, and with them came the undeniable stamp of the bloodline. The sloping brow, the hollow cheeks, the slight twist of the jaw, echoes of faces buried in the valley's graveyard for generations. One humid evening, Cora made the long walk to their house for what she knew would be the last time. Eliza met her at the door, pale as ever, but there was no trace of the frightened girl she'd been a year ago. She had the quiet, resigned look of someone who had accepted her place in the order of things. Jonah sat on the floor nearby, staring at a patch of sunlight as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. "Has he spoken yet?" Cora asked. Eliza shook her head. "He doesn't need to." The midwife understood. In the valley, speech was not the only way history was carried forward. Sometimes it was in the silence, in the shape of a jawline, in the pale flicker of an eye that wandered from yours. Jonah was the valley's future, not in the hopeful sense, but in the inevitable one. He would grow, he would remain, and he would pass on the only thing the valley had ever truly kept, itself. When Cora left that night, the sun was sinking behind the mountains, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her with slow, deliberate intent. She did not look back at the house. She knew it would still be there in 10 years, in 20, with the same faces peering from behind drawn curtains. Because here, time didn't move forward. It folded in on itself, generation after generation, until every ending was only another beginning. And somewhere in the valley, Jonah's quiet breathing blended with the whisper of the wind, carrying the unbroken echo of blood. Forever.